Few political symbols have become universal across the planet, like that of Ernesto Che Guevara. The history of guerrillas and socialism in Hispanic America are intimately linked to his name and sometimes elevated to the watchtower of the great men of history. However, as with many other cases, little is known about the history of the man behind the myth. Despite his short time on Earth of 39 years, Che Guevara had an intense, nomadic, and agitated life between intrepid motorcycle trips across the continent and the earth-shaking Cuban Revolution. From his birth in Argentina to his execution in Bolivia, Che Guevara's birthplace, his family, his own actions and ideas were decisive in the chain of events that led to the man who became a martyr. Today we are going to learn his story in the most objective way possible. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and you can give great support to our channel simply by liking the video, leaving your comments, sharing it on social networks and with your acquaintances, and collaborating on our Patreon, which you can find below. Without anything else to add, let's get started. Contrary to popular belief, Che Guevara descended from a wealthy family of high society in Argentina. His mother, Celia de la Serna, is said to be a descendant of the Viceroy of Peru, José de la Serna e Hinojosa, as well as Argentine generals of independence and prominent landowners. On the other hand, Che Guevara's father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, was a descendant of Julian Lynch Ayru, who for a long time was considered the richest man in South America. In addition, his genealogy highlights Spanish and Irish nobles from the colonial era. Upon getting married, Celia and Ernesto bought large tracts of land in the Misiones region of Argentina to cultivate yerba mate. Che Guevara was thus born in Rosario on May 14, 1928. In his childhood, he alternated residence with his family every so often between Buenos Aires, Misiones, Altagracia, and other locations, living in estates and villas with all the comforts. Ernesto, due to the asthma he suffered all his life, could not regularly attend school until he was 9 years old, so his mother was the teacher with whom he learned to read and write during his early years. Ernesto assimilated some characteristics from his mother: the rebellion, loyalty, obstinacy, and being resolute. Doña Celia was known for not being religious and doing things that were illicit for women at that time, such as smoking, driving cars, wearing pants, and even inviting people from lower classes to her quarters. Cha was rebellious, fiery, and disobedient. During school, friends and teachers remembered that Che, although he was intelligent, did not pay much attention to studies and rather used to lead the pranks with his classmates. In his youth, he was influenced by his father's views. Guevara Lynch always sympathized with the anti-Franco cause of the Spanish emigrants, forming a support committee for the Spanish left and receiving many of them on his properties. In 1942, the Guevaras moved to Cordoba for Ernesto to continue secondary education. Outside of school and after rugby, in addition to his love affairs, it was usual to see him reading Freud, Baudelaire, Dumas, Verlaine, Solá, and Argentine classics like Sarmiento's Facundo. The teenage Che Guevara mingled with boys from all social classes. Che's family was decidedly leftist, anti-fascist, and anti-Peronist. They complained about the neutrality of the Argentine government during the Second World War, but the teenage Che cared very little about all of that. By 1945, at 17 years of age, he begins the philosophy course in school and dedicates himself with considerable interest to the study of this branch. He receives his first impressions of Marx from the quotes of the German Führer in his famous book Mein Kampf. He makes his own philosophical dictionary with biographical sketches of Freud, Camus, Sartre, Kafka, Aristotle, Nietzsche, and others. Upon turning 18 years old in the middle of 1946, the Elche family faces economic problems. After leaving high school, he gets a job as a soil inspector for the province of Cordoba. That same year, Juan Domingo Perón assumes his first term as president of Argentina. After the death of his grandmother in 1947 and for various reasons, Ernesto decides to study medicine and thus enters the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Buenos Aires. He perfects his taste for chess, constantly dedicates himself to reading, makes philosophical annotations, played a lot of rugby, and even wrote articles about this sport, all while continuing his medical career. In this second reading opportunity, he rediscovers Karl Marx and begins to pay more attention to his works, which he gradually notes in his philosophical dictionary. Socialism continues to take more preference in his thinking. Even so, he showed no intention of joining any left-wing movement, perhaps because of the state of hostility against the left during the governments of Juan Perón, and also because he was convinced that the Argentine Communist Party and the General Confederation of Workers were very sectarian. These were decisive years for Latin American fate. The post-war situation and the clash between Americans and Soviets intensified the interventionist policy of the United States on the region to safeguard its geopolitical interests, generating a decisive hatred of Ernesto towards the American country, which according to his acquaintances was irremediably rooted in his anti-imperialist thinking that he was developing at that time. While studying, he also undertakes some smaller-scale businesses such as the manufacture of pesticides in his home's garage and door-to-door shoe sales. But without a doubt, a sign of his bohemian and rebellious life was his fervent taste for long trips and excursions. Thus, in 1950, he sets off on a small bicycle powered by an Italian engine towards the northwest of Argentina. In a period of 6 weeks, he passes through Córdoba, Las Salinas Grandes, Santiago del Estero, Tucumán, Salta and Jujuy. In his motorcycle diary, published years later, he recounts many of the experiences he has on the road, and in all of them, it is noticeable that for the first time, Ernesto feels in an environment according to his way of being, hostile, nomadic, and changing. His companions were vagabonds, prisoners, and other travelers who found their way and with whom he used to embark on small conversations. In addition, using his medical student ID, he managed to get free lodgings in leper colonies and small hospitals. In the Argentine Northwest, he witnessed the deficiencies and economic struggles of the disadvantaged classes. He returned to Buenos Aires in mid-February to continue his medical studies. By 1951, Ernesto, at 23 years old, is not motivated by study, city life, or his medical career. Only the constant desire to travel moved him, and he was burdened by the unrequited love he had for Maria del Carmen Chichina Ferreira, a woman he had fallen hopelessly in love with. His close friend Alberto Granado proposes a plan much more ambitious than his current lifestyle. A journey of Latin American magnitude, Alberto did not trust any man more adventurous than Ernesto, and Ernesto did not have another friend who understood him so well in his needs as a nomadic man. So they would leave on a motorcycle on January 14th, 1952 from the city of Miramar. In total, the adventure lasted from January to August 1952, which revealed characteristics of his way of acting and thinking. For example, he not only notes and denounces the precariousness that usually exists in Latin American towns and in provincial villages, but also unleashes his disdain against certain groups. In Peru, he narrates an incident with a local who he presumes was attracted to the same sex in the following way. Quote, "In the evening, there was a family party that resulted in a serious fight with Mr. Lezama Beltran, of a childish and introverted spirit who was probably inverted," end quote. In Venezuela, specifically in Caracas, he notes the following about the people who populated the popular neighborhoods, quote, "The blacks, the same magnificent specimens of the African race, who have maintained their racial purity, thanks to their little attachment to the bath, have seen their realms invaded by a new specimen of slave, the Portuguese. And the two old races have begun a hard life together, populated by quarrels and pettiness of all kinds. Contempt and poverty unite them in the daily struggle, but the different way of facing life completely separates them. The indolent and dreamy black man spends his little money on any frivolity or in hitting a few sticks, end quote. In addition, I dedicate a few lines to his emerging and growing tendencies for combat and violence, open quote. I will stain my weapon in blood, and mad with fury, I will slit the throat when defeated falls into my hands. I already feel my nostrils dilated, savoring the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood of enemy death, close quote. Ernesto returns to Argentina after the death of Evita Perón, wife of President Juan Domingo Perón. Her death left Argentina in a prolonged struggle. However, Ernesto neither mourned nor celebrated the physical disappearance of the Argentine First Lady, as he still held some animosity towards politics. Ernesto's mind was not on politics but on his studies. After another year of dedication, on April 11th of 1953, he passes the final exam and calls his father saying, "This is Dr. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna speaking." The joy of Guevara Lynch, however, was fleeting. As soon as his son finished his medical career, thirsty for adventure, he was already planning another trip, this time with his friend Carlos Ferrer. They leave on July 7th of 1953 from Buenos Aires to the border town of La Quiaca. From there they go to La Paz in Bolivia and witness with approval the Bolivia convulsed by the emergence of the revolutionary nationalist movement that dissolves the armed forces, takes over the country's mines, and undertakes a failed agrarian reform. In Peru and Ecuador, they live from precariousness to precariousness, with Ernesto even selling many of his belongings like a fine suit that his parents had given him before he left. Without hesitation, he sold everything he had to seemingly pursue nothing on a path with an uncertain destination. Ernesto and other Argentines sailed from Guayaquil to Panama, hoping to reach Guatemala and join the unique revolution under Jacobo Arbenz. In Panama, Che feels that he begins his forays into the so-called banana republics, living in houses where they charged him $1 a day. His forays would be made by train, cheap buses, hitchhiking, and even covering long distances on foot. He continues his journey from Panama, passing through Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. After several setbacks, the Argentinians arrive in Guatemala City on the morning of December 24th. In Guatemala, the interests of the American fruit monopoly were clashing with the nationalist government of Jacobo Arbenz. The United Fruit Company was the main owner of arable land in Guatemala and kept much of these properties idle without being worked. Arbenz was in the sights of the United States when he decided to revoke 156,000 of the multinational's 222,000 hectares. Measures like this in favor of the peasantry and against powerful internal and external groups earned Arbenz a coup d'etat orchestrated by the Central Intelligence Agency, the United Fruit Company, and several people from the Guatemalan elite. Meanwhile, Ernesto meets a Peruvian woman named Hilda Gadia. Hilda had important connections with the Guatemalan Communist Party as well as the Peruvian American Popular Revolutionary Alliance and leftist organizations throughout Latin America. Che had always stayed out of activism, but through Hilda he finally gives in and gets fully involved in politics and active militancy. Hilda falls madly in love with Che and is the one who financially supports Ernesto during his stay in Guatemala. Despite not being in love with her because he considered her unattractive for his tastes, he was in a relationship with Hilda for reasons of convenience, which he himself would acknowledge. President Arbenz is overthrown on June 27, 1954. Hilda and Che decide to leave for Mexico as Hilda, a woman with many connections, had secured a place there where they could not pursue her. As Ernesto and Hilda arrive in Mexico, a young Cuban named Fidel Castro Ruz also arrives, known for his participation in the attempted takeover of the Moncada military barracks during the government of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba. Cuba was a country, like many on the continent, where a good part of the population lived under austere and frugal conditions. However, in recent decades, the island had experienced a steady economic and social advancement that placed it as one of the most prosperous countries in the region. However, it was not exempt from all kinds of problems and revolutionary groups seeking to overthrow President Batista. After the assault on the Moncada barracks, Fidel Castro had been sentenced to prison. But 2 years later, in 1955, he was pardoned by President Batista himself, which ended up exiling him to the United States, and from there, he went to Mexico. In both nations, he worked to gain financial and political backing from influential figures of diverse ideologies to bolster the armed battle against Batista. Even the Central Intelligence Agency, through the former Cuban president Carlos Prio Socarrás, supports the formation of guerrillas against Batista. The failure of the Moncada barracks had endowed Castro with a revolutionary aura that gave him a high national prominence and in international groups. In this way, Ernesto and Fidel met one night in Mexico. It is said that they got along quite well, both recognized in the other a high degree of culture, intelligence, and audacity. However, it was known by their companions the strange admiration and submission of Che to the will of Fidel Castro, perhaps electrified by a more overwhelming personality than his own. Ernesto is finally seduced into joining Fidel's ambitious plans and the revolutionary causes of Hispanic America. Hilda and Ernesto get married and even have a daughter, Hilda Beatriz Guevara, born in 1956, the same year that Fidel, his brother Raúl, Ernesto, and the other revolutionaries based in Mexico create the so-called July 26th movement to promote the armed struggle against Batista in Cuba. Beyond his affinities for socialist ideas, Ernesto turns to armed struggle not so much for any aspiration of power, but for his nomadic spirit and his longing for adventure and adrenaline and violence that guided him to the most dangerous and unlikely ventures. Finally, after months of difficulties and planning, Fidel, Raúl, and Ernesto leave Mexico on November 25th, 1956, heading to the island of Cuba to encourage a revolution that would change the history of the island and that would have continental repercussions to this day. The July 26th movement, or also called 1026, commanded by Fidel Castro, arrives in Cuba 2 days later than planned. On December 5th, Batista's army had anticipated them and the revolutionaries suffer serious setbacks and are forced to retreat into the mythical Sierra Maestra. Of the 82 men who were with Fidel, Raúl, Che, and Camilo Cienfuegos, barely more than 20 remained. In the Sierra Maestra, they gathered to replan their strategy. They had simultaneously formed in Cuba other armed groups that were not under the command of Fidel Castro, such as the Revolutionary Directory that carries out actions like the failed takeover of the presidential palace in Cuba, an action condemned by Fidel Castro for not participating in it. In March of '57, shortly after arriving, Fidel gives interviews to American journalists Heber Matthews of the New York Times, the most read in the U.S., and Robert Haber and others from Columbia Broadcasting System. These interviews, with a favorable tone towards the guerrillas, turned international public opinion in favor of Fidel Castro and in favor of the overthrow of Batista in May of '57. The first armed confrontation led by Castro and Che takes place in the Uero combat in July. Castro, along with other leaders, published the Havana Manifesto in which they promised to hold free elections once Batista is overthrown. The reality is that during the year '57, the M26 guerrilla was captivated without much mobility. Little by little, they are recruiting peasants to the guerrilla who must endure the tropical humid climate of the mountains, and they are threatened with death penalty any form of desertion or betrayal. Che serves as the guerrilla's doctor and attends to the sick, but he also quickly gains a leadership position and Fidel's trust. In parallel, other dissident groups from the Cuban armed forces are also conspiring against President Batista. In April of '56, Batista suffers a failed military coup that seriously weakens the cohesion of the armed forces. In September of '57, military personnel from the Cienfuegos naval base rebel against him, but they are defeated again. By July of 1957, the MM-26 guerrilla had 125 fighters, which Fidel divided into two columns and gave Ernesto the trust and leadership of the second column with 75 fighters. Thus, Commander Guevara's column is divided into 5 platoons, led by Juan Almeida, Ramiro Valdez, Ciro Redondo, and Lalo Sardinas. Che writes to Hilda that in the mountains he lived with a thirst for blood, and it was certainly so. At the dawn of the conflict, when the morale of the guerrilla was declining, Che finds a man of dubious loyalty and executes him to show the others what would happen if they betrayed the revolutionary focus. With unchanging coldness, Che did not hesitate to apply this same punishment with his own hands more than 100 times to members of his troops during the rebellion for charges of desertion against the revolutionaries. The 1026 creates some small cells in towns and cities to recruit members, sabotage the government, and execute government officials. At the beginning of 58, they achieved new victories, but were still confined to the foothills of Sierra Maestra. Then, Fidel Castro reorganizes the guerrilla and sends Che Guevara to the military school in Minas del Frio for the preparation of the new recruits. Che obeys with some anger that he has been sent to the rear. In March of that year, after pressure from prominent actors, the United States decrees that they will stop selling weapons to Batista, and American diplomats on the island begin to pressure Batista to seek a way out of power. Many of the weapons in the hands of the guerrillas were of American origin. By April, the M26 calls for a general strike that results in a failure in the population. In May, Batista launches a coordinated military campaign against the guerrillas. After some confrontations, the guerrillas manage to slip into the mountains of the island. After having the M26 besieged in August, months after the offensive, Batista orders the withdrawal of the government troops. The rationale for this action, despite having the ability to fight the guerrillas, is still debated and speculated upon today. Taking advantage of the withdrawal of the government troops, Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos are sent to the center of the island to prepare an attack against the strategic city of Santa Clara. After 6 weeks of hiking, Che arrives at Escambray. In December, while all this is happening, the United States intensifies its measures against Batista and decrees an embargo against the Cuban government. Meanwhile, many of the military who had attempted the coup against Batista remained within the armed forces, pressuring him to leave. The crucial powers that supported Batista had turned their backs on him. At his moment of greatest weakness, Fidel orders the dispersal of the troops to the rest of Cuba. Che fights with Camilo Cienfuegos in the center of Cuba and manages to get several government detachments to surrender. With some misfortunes, the revolutionaries led by Ernesto Guevara managed to besiege Santa Clara in December. They then managed to advance towards the city and take a government armored train that had been sent to fortify it with key weaponry. Faced with internal military pressures, the withdrawal of support from the United States, and guerrilla unrest, Batista finally decides to leave Cuba along with his wife and children. Power is fragilely left in the hands of one of the military conspirators against Batista, General Eulogio Cantillo. But Fidel and the guerrillas reject the attempt to form a new military government board without them, with the slogan, "Revolution, yes, and coup no." Che and all the guerrillas spread throughout Cuba receive the order to go to Havana and take key positions. There they are received by crowds who sang their praises, the same crowds that a few months ago came out to vociferously support Batista. Ecstatic, the revolutionaries commit several crimes, abuses and shootings, including Che Guevara. When they arrive in Havana, they imprison Eulogio Cantillo and General Barquin, who was another renowned military figure who was against Batista. Conflicts persist between the M26, the Revolutionary Directory, and other guerrilla and political groups. Fidel advances to Santiago de Cuba and declares it the provisional capital of the Republic. And he appoints a president and a provisional government with various actors, and he proclaims himself as commander of the armed forces. The United States recognizes the newly created provisional government. With the chant of homeland or death, an era for Cuba was being buried. Now Che would be a participant in the new Cuba that was about to be born. From Santiago de Cuba, on January 8, 1959, Fidel triumphantly entered Havana. The new government was initially presided over by Manuel Urrutia and his cabinet by civilian politicians of different tendencies, with Fidel Castro as military commander. However, facing a disintegrated armed force, it didn't take too long for Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and other revolutionaries to form a parallel government that, along with other political maneuvers, was gradually displacing the civilian government and consolidating Castro as the sole leader of the state. Che Guevara is assigned the command of the La Cabaña fortress and is in charge of the so-called revolutionary trials against the military and representatives of Batista's government. Here, Che becomes a true executioner who, without much trial, executes approximately 550 people during the year 1959. Not only former representatives of Batista's government, but also revolutionary dissidents. Following the accusations for these events, Che Guevara goes on to say in his famous speech at the UN in 1954, "Yes, we have executed, we execute, and we will continue to execute as long as necessary. Our struggle is a fight to the death. We know what the result of a lost battle would be, and the worms also have to know what the result is, but we do not commit murders like the Venezuelan police, which I believe is called DIJEPOL, if I'm not mistaken, is committing right now. This police force committed a series of acts of barbarism, of murders, and then dumped the bodies in some places. This happened against people, for example, students and so on." End quote. Going back to the year 1950. And 9 in parallel, the command of the cabin, Che now receives Cuban nationality for his services in the revolution, and is one of those involved in the formulation of the agrarian reform of May 7, 1959, which prohibits foreign ownership of farms and sugar axes. At the same time, it seeks to favor the small farmer, cutting rents and exempting some producers from taxes according to their monthly income. Then, without much real knowledge concerning the industry, the economy, or marketing, he assumes positions of prime importance in these areas. The first was as president of the Bank of Cuba between November of 59 and February of 61, and the other position was as Minister of Industry between February of the year 61 and April of 1965. Such was the trust and consideration that Fidel Castro had for Che's leadership that a foreigner who barely knew Cuba and its economy ended up occupying high-level government positions for the industry and politics. In these positions, he tries to carry out the traditional measures of socialism in order to diversify the Cuban economy. The result was a debt of $50 million to American oil companies by postponing payments for the received oil, a decrease in the production of all items on the island, the bureaucratic centralization of the means of production in a single entity that was the Ministry of Industries, the nationalization of the large national and international banks that made life in Cuba during its most prosperous time, and the confiscation of countless American assets, and those of the Cubans themselves, resulting in about 542 confiscated companies. After these expropriations, the United States decreed a trade embargo against Cuba, excluding food, medicines, and basic goods, and allowing other countries to trade with the island. By 1962, the embargo intensifies after the famous missile crisis. However, it is relaxed again after this crisis is resolved. The new directors of the recently expropriated companies in Cuba would be young people who fought with Guevara in the revolution, who lacked experience and technical knowledge, while capital was fleeing the country along with several of its best professionals. Che Guevara's handling of Cuba's economic and industrial affairs resulted in a reduction in sugar production, harvested lands, manufactured products, and soon Fidel Castro's government finds itself in need of decreeing the rationing of food products such as eggs, milk, chicken, meat, rice, fish, and other proteins indispensable in the human diet. Thus began the long history that has consumed Cuba for almost 70 years, marked by the precariousness and material deterioration of the island. Another task that Che Guevara performs as a Cuban diplomat was to travel to various socialist countries such as the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, China, North Korea, India, East Germany, and Egypt to win the favor of these countries for the stuck Cuban trade, a goal that he somehow achieves, marking the end of relations between Cuba and the United States at the governmental and public level for a long time, and the definitive positioning of Cuba openly with the Soviet bloc. Fidel decides to remove Che from Cuban public life, sending him to other parts of the world. Thus, in 1964, he travels to the Congo to lead a Cuban troop sent to support the revolution that was brewing from Tanzania. It is important to clarify that Che was a follower of the so-called FOCO theory, a position that defends the creation of revolutionary foci of 25 to 35 people in different parts of a certain political community and the world in order to accelerate revolutionary processes. According to him, it would be a decidedly violent group of peasants led by literate people with the sole purpose of destabilizing the current government until the establishment of a revolutionary one. There were not a few countries that suffered invasion attempts under the FOCO theory strategy, with revolutionary foci sent from Fidel's Cuba and planned by Che Guevara himself. Some were Venezuela, Argentina, Nicaragua, Peru, and Colombia. Back in Congo, Che writes a letter to Fidel that was supposed to be secret, where he decides to renounce Cuban nationality, the Ministry of Industries, and any responsibility with the revolutionary government. Fidel Castro exposes the letter in public, and this marks the definitive end of Che's political responsibilities in Cuba and a turning point in the relationship between Che and Fidel. Che's armed expedition in the very distant and different Congo fails. The wandering revolutionary Che leaves Congo with a shaved beard, a fine suit, and a decent haircut so as not to be recognized. He goes to Prague, where he stays for 5 months, in a house of the Cuban Secret Service, and from where he plans where he will establish the next revolutionary focus. Official? He chose Bolivia due to its central location in South America, allowing him to establish focuses in Peru, Chile, Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. In July of '66, he goes to Cuba for the last time, where Fidel Castro gives him just about 15 guerrillas and very few resources, coupled with the false promise that the Bolivian Communist Party of Manuel Monge and some factions in Chile, Argentina, and Peru would support the guerrilla incursion into the country. Ye arrives in Bolivia with extreme caution in November 1966. 2 years earlier, around the same time in Bolivia, General René Barrientos had overthrown the leftist government of Victorino Paz Estenssoro. Che's goal was to support the resistance of the revolutionary nationalist movement with the focus that was being formed for him. Finally, under the name of the National Liberation Army of Bolivia, Che recruits a total of 47 men. 16 Cubans, 26 Bolivians, 3 Peruvians, and 2 Argentinians. But the Bolivian Communist Party was not willing to support an armed struggle led by a foreigner who did not accept other leaderships above him, so they turned their back on him. The government of Barrientos, which had outlawed the Communist Party upon learning of the guerrilla presence in the country, immediately requests support from the Central Intelligence Agency to find the guerrillas. Defeat after defeat and desertion after desertion. Finally, on October 7th, in the Ural Ravine, the focus suffers an ambush in which Che is wounded in the arm and is arrested with another guerrilla named Willie. From the Ural Ravine, the prisoners were taken to La Higuera, where, in a school transformed into a prison, they would wait for orders. The fate was already cast. The High Military Command of Bolivia gives the order to execute Che Guevara, even though the Central Intelligence Agency advocated for keeping him alive for interrogation. But President Barrientos had been very clear. At 1:10 in the afternoon, on October 9th, 1967, the conventual silence of the Bolivian Sierras was momentarily interrupted by a burst of gunfire. In front of the firing squad falls a desolate, bearded, and abandoned man with leathers tied on his feet instead of boots and with sewn and moth-eaten fabrics instead of a uniform. It was hard to think that this desolate corpse was Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, universally known as Che Guevara, a popular icon of our times, admired by some and repudiated by many, amidst the mythology of the socialist revolution and the hunger of the Cuban people. A global symbol of a left that today looks very little like the left for which Che took up arms. Before entering politics, he was a born agitator. Ernesto Che Guevara dies for his ideas, convictions, and actions. He killed and died based on his way of being, rebellious, unruly, and aggressive. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you liked it, and I invite you once again to support us by liking it, leaving your comments, sharing it on all the social networks you have, following us on our Instagram called The New Encyclopedia, and collaborating on our Patreon, which you can find below. Thank you very much again, and may God bless you.